Well, fellas, we're finally at that part of the year again where I got to talk about the top 10 games that came out last year. And 2022, it was, at least to me, it was a great year. It was not just a great year for video games, but also a great year for events that happened in my life. But anyway, as per usual with these lists, let's talk about some honorable mentions first. I know some people might think that this year was a real bummer, but with every year there's at least 10 great games to play that'll come out, and this year is thankfully no exception. But, as with every other year, there's a short list of honorable mentions that we should get out of the way first. These games are usually not on the list for one reason or another, but the ones that I feel deserve their own special little mention. First honorable mention we're going to talk about is Isonzo by Black Mill Games, which is the latest in their World War I game series, following Verdun and Tannenberg, but this time around it takes us to the Italian Alpine front against the dastardly Austro-Hungarians. While the World War I game series isn't the most exciting or advanced of first-person shooters, they provide a very interesting look at what the actual weapons and armies of the First World War actually looked like, instead of games like Battlefield 1's very, let's say, stylistic approach. And there's an extra layer to the whole game, with it being set in the locales of the Alpine War that the Kingdom of Italy and the Austro-Hungarian Empire found themselves in, because it is so completely different from what people are accustomed to. The high heights and beautiful valleys of the Alps is definitely different than the trenches of the Western Front. Sadly, I haven't gotten a chance to play with it yet, nor did any of my super reliable pals end up getting it, which is a shame, because if I did, it would have easily made it onto the list. Now, I might be a little biased perché ora vivo in Italia, ma veramente è un peccato che non sia entrato alla lista. Ma comunque, andiamo alla prossima. Next one in the honorable mentions is Faith Chapter 3, and as a whole the entire Unholy Trinity that finally came out this year. In this Atari-styled game, you play the role of John Ward, who's a Catholic priest who's finishing an unsanctioned exorcism of a girl in rural Connecticut, which of course goes horribly wrong. The game is known for its very unique spookies painstakingly rotoscoped by developer Erdorf himself, and the final result is absolutely gorgeous as it is spooky and terrifying. It's genuinely such an incredibly unique visual style, with some of the horrific demons and possessed souls staying in your mind long after you shut the game down. But while I'm glad that Erdorf finally released the full product this year, it narrowly avoids the list because while as it is as a whole it makes for a great package, only the third game came out this year. And as just one game, I think there's more interesting games that came out this year, but no shade at all at Erdorf. And fellas, if you're really interested in a bunch of spooks that are done in this Atari rotoscope sort of style, then look no further than Faith, because it's honestly like a pretty incredible game. But that ain't the final honorable mention on our list, and that one goes to a game that took me absolutely by surprise. If you would have told me that I would have enjoyed a Marble Cape Shish game to the point that I regret not playing it the previous year, I would have thought that your head is full of doo-doo. But in an incredible turn of events, Eidos Montreal actually made an incredible game in Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy that I am so glad that I actually took the time, notched down my snobby patrician taste, and gave the game a chance that I otherwise would have normally scoffed at. And while I will say that the gameplay is not the best, it certainly gets the job done for the kind of game that Guardians is, because the real meat of the whole experience is in the game's narrative and characters. To put it short, this is like a nearly 20-hour-long Guardians film, but with the jokes that are actually, funnier, and the overall narrative that hits the right emotional beats better than the James Gunn film have, and I am gonna go there. In a sense, I still feel insane because this is 2022, Anno Domini, and there was a Cape Shish property that actually made me almost tear up a couple of times in its story. Because apart from a few things I've written off, pretty much most superhero movies, as they're just really not interesting for me anymore. Somehow though, the team at Eidos Montreal actually got down and dirty and made an incredibly fun experience to play through that'll make you laugh, make you get pumped up, trying to speed away from crashing asteroids to the tune of a flock of seagulls, and maybe even tear up at some parts of the narrative. What's the wildest part is that I got into this game as merely a curiosity to see what Mary DeMarle, who's the narrative director on the new Mass Effect game, might have in store for us. And after playing the game and enjoying the Deus Ex prequels, which he has done the narrative director role for as well, I can firmly say that I have some good confidence in the next Mass Effect. Honestly, fellas, if it had come out this year, then I probably would have absolutely put this on the list, and probably at a high spot. But sadly, it didn't. So if you got Game Pass, it's on there for you to enjoy. And if you don't, well, let's keep going. And that brings us to the end of the honorable mentions. There are a bunch of great games, but to be honest, they are no top 10 of 2022. So let's get on to that with number 10.
Number 10.
My son detected.
Grab him. Hey, what are you doing?
Say I don't need anyone.
What the hell?
But I do.
There was an outbreak.
Why is it all
They killed everyone.
misery
Trying to contain it.
that I choose?
Everyone.
All of my nightmares.
Now. Before you get all up on my face and fillet me alive for having this game on here because it's such an easy target for criticism, let me just explain fully how, despite the flaws, I actually ended up really enjoying Callisto Protocol. The Callisto Protocol takes place in the 24th century where Jacob Lee, a contract freighter played and mocapped by Josh Duhamel, have crash-landed on Jupiter's moon of Callisto, where he is summarily thrown into a prison, which is terrible not just for his track record, but also because a breakout happens with a bunch of mutated goopies. It is now up to Jacob and several others to help each other out of the muck of Black Iron Prison and escape Callisto before whatever infection has broken out in the depths of Black Iron consumes them all. Okay, hold on a sec, hold your horses. Now, the Callisto Protocol, I'm not going to say it's a perfect game, because to be very honest, it's not a perfect game. It's got quite a few flaws that we're going to get into, but the main takeaway with it on this list is that you got to understand that my justification is that I enjoyed it and I had a great time with it, but before that, let's talk about some things that I didn't enjoy so much. First of all, the obvious flaw that everyone is talking about on PC is the admittedly pretty bad performance, and while the game has some great visuals, I don't really think it warrants how shoddy the frame rate can be. Luckily, I found a sweet spot that worked the best for me, where it has the best performance that I can get for the best visuals to see, and when it hit that spot, the frame rate, while not the most stable, it would rarely dip below 30, which is my only real requirement. Some of my other criticisms is that I don't find the game scary, which for one is completely subjective. What I consider spooky might not spook someone else and vice versa, but more importantly, the way I look at it is there's not really much that spooks me these days. Talking among some buds from school, having some of them say, well, it wasn't very scary, it wasn't as scary as Dead Space, I can't help but kind of scoff at it. Like, duh. The things that spooked us when we were teenagers and kids aren't going to hit the same as an adult who were now really kind of accustomed to survival horror. There's certainly more flaws out there with the Callisto Protocol, but the most egregious flaw for me was the performance issues with Callisto Protocol, and honestly, those have kind of been ironed out by now anyways, so they're not really that big, but let's talk about the narrative for a little bit. Okay, so another element of the Callisto Protocol that I will admit isn't the most interesting is its narrative. Certainly not that it's kind of awful by any means, but I feel that it has a bit of a sins of the father syndrome with it. It's not going to be something that you're going to remember after the credits roll, especially with that cliffhanger ending that it has, but the narrative for the most part does a decent job of getting you from the beginning to the end. There's also a Dead Space-sized elephant in the room that this game will naturally be compared to Dead Space from 2008, which is fine considering that this is sort of a spiritual successor and the director worked on that prior franchise. Personally, I like to try and review games in a bubble as best that I can to give it a decent shakedown. So when I played it, I didn't get the same vitriol that some people are going after this game since I'm not actively comparing it to Dead Space at every single little turn. I just think it's a bit silly. People always complain that there's always remakes and sequels, but when a new IP with some flaws that could grow to something better comes out, then they always compare it to the loving darling that came out a million years ago. And to me, it's just, frankly, it's kind of annoying, it's kind of obnoxious, and people need to stop it. Okay, that's enough complaining from me for a little bit, but since I really did actually enjoy this game, let's get into the gameplay loop, which some might consider divisive, but I really enjoyed it, so let's talk. Yet another element that you either love it or you hate it, but I love the gameplay loop that Callisto provided, which consists of shooting things before they get up too close, using your telekinesis to throw them into the obviously non-OSHA approved wall of spikes, and then beating the hell out of them with your stun baton. And while the shooting is kind of the same in all third-person shooters, Callisto's emphasis on melee combat to me felt really refreshing, with its simple but enjoyable dodge mechanic and absolutely outrageous beatdowns that you put on these mutants. It's really hard to explain, but for me, the melee was just incredibly fun and satisfying to play. It could be the mixture of it being just tactile enough to be followed with the presentation of brutally beating somebody, and then you follow it up with some even more beatdowns or pulling out your shotgun and blasting them to pieces. You combine that all together and it made for a really satisfying loop that, while some might find repetitive, it itched the spot for me just enough right up till the end, and I really enjoyed it. And to continue with things that I really enjoyed with the Callisto Protocol, let's talk about the game's presentation. While it takes a lot of your machine to display, what does end up getting shown on screen with Callisto Protocol is top of the line when it comes to graphics and particle effects. Usually games don't wow me in this way, but how everything looked from the hardest of bulkheads to the goopiest of enemies really inserted me into this moon of Jupiter. Likewise, the scans that they did for the actors is just top notch. Really do get to see all these subtle facial expressions that are difficult to get in rudimentary motion capture that makes these characters feel more like real people instead of just a scan baked into a model. So while most of the performances were just okay, I do feel that Duhamel's as Jacob really did work for me. There's so many times where he's had enough of this nonsense going on at Black Iron that you just feel how tired he is of the whole thing. And finally, another part of the presentation that I love are all these dumbass like big movie moments you can tell were taken from Schofield's day at working at Call of Duty. It's not intelligent like writing or cinema, but these big movements where there's like big explosions and the ship's crashing down, it's so much dumb fun to go through, and I really enjoyed.
Go! 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 Go!
So that basically wraps up Callisto Protocol, and like I said at the beginning, it's on this list because, to be honest, I just really enjoyed playing through it. It has a combat system that many might consider divisive, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was fun, and despite all the critics and the haters and all that stuff, well, they can be damned, because the only justification is me. I know it's not the critically most grounded way to put something on this list, but the fact of the matter is that despite all its flaws, I had a lot of fun with the Callisto Protocol. It's not high cinema, it's not the scariest game out there, and it certainly runs poor in some systems, but with the incredibly satisfying loop of blasting enemies and then beating them till their heads pop like a rotten grapefruit, or throwing them at comically giant spinning fans, it was just a blast to play through for me. It kind of reminds me a lot of the initial reaction to The Evil Within, because everyone hated that game when it came out, but warmed up to it in time, and while I don't think the Callisto Protocol is as good or as underrated as The Evil Within was, give it time, and I think it's going to be a decent game to play through. Really, my friends, if you want to play a space horror game where you primarily beat enemies to death and see Josh Duhamel get his head bitten off numerous times, then I would recommend for everybody else to maybe just wait till it's about the €20 range and you're gonna have a fun blast playing through it. But fellas, this is only the beginning of the list, so with that, let's talk about some more horror games down later on in the list, because we got some really good juicy stuff coming in later on the list. But Without further delay, let's get to number 9.
Number 9.
Thing about the Weird West is, it ain't kind. Flesh eaters took your husband, killed your son cold. Time to dig up them shooting irons. The town, flesh eaters were here. Time for some persuasion. How you gonna play this out? Clean and quiet? Or something more resolute?
Coming in at number 9 is the only game with West in the title that came out in 2022 that is worth a damn. So forget all those other imposters, for the real deal is in Weird West, which is the debut game by Wolfeye Studios. This brand new indie studio created from the heads at Arcane that brought us such classics as Arx Fatalis to Dishonored, and of course the wonderful 2017 reboot to Prey. Weird West tells the tale of 5 different souls whose lives have been irreparably changed by the horrors that occur in the Weird West, and the only thing between them and a dirtnap El Paso style is their wits, their hip iron, and maybe a little bit of magic. This is one of those games that just kind of completely caught me by surprise. I just saw it on Game Pass earlier last year and I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna give it a try, and then got surprised by how robust this game is. To crunch down Weird West in the best way that I can, I'll say that it's a bit of a classic CRPG, aka computer RPG, combined with a lot of immersive sim elements and then sprinkled on top with a little bit of twin stick shooter gameplay. Quick rundown for both immersive sims and CRPG are that immersive sims are a genre of game like BioShock or System Shock, Dishonored, or even Deus Ex, where you're usually given a high degree of control over the environment to complete your objectives. But truthfully, there really kinda isn't a real good definition for an immersive sim, but just think of it like games like Deus Ex or Dishonored, and that's kinda pretty much what you need. Meanwhile, CRPGs, which are usually top-down isometric role-playing games such as the original Fallouts, Planescape Torment, or even more modern experiences like Atom RPG, these games are known typically for their writing and interesting stories that they tell. And while it might sound like a lot of nonsense, just know when it comes to the narrative, it's like a CRPG and how you interact with people. But then in the gameplay, it takes a lot of influence from their other work and how they use the environment to their advantage. Whether it's using a barrel to bunch a dump of toxins onto unsuspecting enemies to poison them, or using the same barrel to get yourself onto a different vantage point and then take advantage of the high ground, Weird West tries to give you the tools for you to complete the game however you wish. But while it changes a little bit between which of the 5 characters that you play through, in the end it's all up to playing the game with the tools that the game has given you and using whichever valid combination of tools to get the job done. And in doing so, Weird West has made a really unique mix that I don't really see in any of the other West games. Guess it's probably a good time to tackle the narrative of Weird West for a little bit, and while it's nothing too crazy, let's just say it's a little weird. As I said before, you'll play through a variety of different characters that are all connected via a dark sect, which is sort of a proxy for the player going through the different characters. Stories range from a former bounty huntress who retired from the game only to be brought right back in after a band of no-good desperados kill her family, or a pigman punished by the Weird West to an amalgamation of pig and, well, man, to which you have to find your humanity back. But while some characters are more interesting than others, the silver lining is that if you don't like a particular character that much, you won't have to play them for too long before you move on to the next character. Now, a part of the narrative that I like is that it gives you a lot of options on how to go about and change the world, many times coming back to haunt you or to save your butt. For example, if you save certain characters, they'll become a friend for life, which means at certain points in the game, they'll come to your aids and use their own hip iron against the enemies. Later on, you could also recruit the other characters you played as, and they'll join your posse with all the weapons and equipment that you left behind in their playthrough, which is a nice little touch of continuity. As you can probably already see, the game uses a really neat mix of grounded and supernatural elements to spice up the story. You might get down to the bottom of a mystery about a certain gang and figure out that they kidnap people to feed their boss man who's a friggin' ghoul. But all in all, they have a really neat mix of supernatural to realistic elements that you would find in this Weird West. So with that out of the way, it's probably a good time to talk about the presentation of Weird West. So let's talk about the good and, well, the not so good. See, the aesthetics of Weird West can be split up into two easy categories, and that is the splash art that shows for the portraits and in the menus, and then there's the actual 3D models and environments that you play through. The 2D art for the most part is really cool, giving that sort of gritty comic book vibe that makes the characters that you encounter all that bit more interesting. And I'm sure if there was a comic for this, it would probably be pretty cool and I'd probably read it too. But then sadly, there's the real world environments, and while it's not the absolute worst, it all looks just kinda generic, slightly cel-shaded 3D models that you can tell were not really too high on the budget, and personally, rightfully so. If it was either making the game look better or make the game more interesting to play through, I'd rather have the latter every time. And while the 3D visuals are not the most impressive, they get the job done and convey visually what they need to. Though hopefully in future projects, Wolf Eye Studios can increase their presentation to make it truly exceptional. So to kind of wrap this thing up, Weird West is going to take you maybe about 20 hours, and that's kind of normal for immersive sims, but let me tell you fellas, it's going to be a very fun 20 hours if you like immersive sims. I think you can grab the game for around $40 or 40 euros depending where you are, but for the meantime you can pick it up on Game Pass if you got that service, and I highly recommend that you go and do that because Weird West is a really cool game. So when 2022 started, a CRPG immersive sim weirdo hybrid was definitely not on my bingo card, but I'm definitely very glad that Weird West made it onto the list. But that's not the weirdest thing on our list, so let's get on to number 9.
Number 8.
These rejects the best you've got? Throw 'em. Let's see what you can do.
Welcome to Atoma, your home for the rest of your brief lives. Used to be the jewel in the sector. Then the heretics invaded. I need you to go down there and raise hell. Can't say for sure what's waiting in the shadows. Valkyrie exfiltration will be waiting, if you make it that far.
Next game coming up at number 8 takes us all the way to the 41st millennium in Warhammer 40,000 Darktide. The latest entry in the horde-destroying, pox-slashing, demon-banishing series by Swedish developer Fat Shark. Set in the dark future of the 41st millennium, you play the role of a convict for one reason or another who has been accused of a certain crime. And during a boarding action by the forces of chaos, you have allowed an opportunity to redeem yourself in the eyes of the Emperor. From there, you and various other rejects will take part in multiplayer missions in Hive Tertium to combat the nefarious influence of the plague god Nurgle, and hopefully give the Imperium of Man another day to fight in this dark millennium. Oh man, I've been waiting ages for Fat Shark to come in and do a thing with Darktide, and I've been waiting so long for it. And while I love playing as the Ubisreich 5 in Vermintide, I've always wanted Fat Shark to take this game and put it into the dark future of Warhammer 40,000. So, let's talk about it. So if you ever played Vermintide, in that one you had pre-made select characters, while in Darktide you actually create your own character from the get-go, selecting their class from a shooter-focused veteran, the mind-bending, nosebleed-inducing psyker, the zealous mouth flamer-spewing zealot, or the lovable giants with 2-gauge shotgun gauntlets known as the Ugrin. Then, after that, you select your backstory for the character, ranging from what homeworld they came from, what occupation they had, and what they got incarcerated for, eventually finalizing it all with your voice and how your character looks. which just seems to me, in a lot of games, to be the same Scottish zealot in most teams. But I will say that I am partial myself to the female loner psyker. But once you get your freedom back, you'll be one of the endless dregs working with Inquisitor Grendel to go on various missions in Tertium Hive set on the hive world of Atoma Prime, which is essentially a large city consisting of billions that reaches kilometers up into the sky. Tertium is a vital resource to the Imperium, and its continued production of war materials for the endless war the Imperium has found itself in must be secured, so the Inquisition will use all its resources to go against the forces of Nurgle. The narrative is pretty much your standard 40k fare after that. The only thing that makes it truly interesting is that the narrative is written by Dan Abnett, which has written a plethora of outstanding Warhammer fiction, some of my favorites of his being the Gaunt's Ghost novels and the Eisenhorn novels, which if you're not familiar with, you should go out and read them, especially if you're interested in the world of Warhammer 40,000. But from here, I'm very interested to see where the story goes forward with new missions and content, but for now, I will simply be content with the likes of my favorite snotty tech Magos of Hadron Omega 77. But that's enough of the narrative for now. You probably came here for some demon ball busting, so let's talk about the gameplay. If you've ever played Vermintide or Vermintide 2, then the gameplay flow for Darktide will seem all too familiar to you, but if you are one of those that aren't aware, then you pick your character or class, then pick a mission on a map you want to play through, and your lobby will basically start that mission. Darktide is pretty much the same concept this time around, except you have a hub world of the Morningstar as the area where you buy new weapons, improve them at the Mechanicum, and select your missions at the massive hololith of Tertium in the center. But the bulk of the game is you and 3 others going around the various sectors of Tertium and using all your weapons at your disposal to defeat the hordes and hordes of poxwalkers, traitor guardsmen, and other nefarious beings from the Immaterium. This can be done with melee weapons that range the gambit from your typical knives and swords to more gruesome weapons like the chainsword or even two-handed giga chainswords that the zealots use, and even a variety of different power weapons like power swords or staves for the psyker. The biggest change though comes from the introduction of actual firearms to the mix, ranging from auto guns that work similar to what we have today to some of the more 40k standard weapons of Last Rifle and the ever-classic Bolter. And while there were some firearms in Vermintide, the guns in Darktide are on a league of their own, and the design of the maps and the inclusion of more ranged enemies makes the new arsenal fit the style of Vermintide, aka now Darktide, very well. My personal favorite has to be the flamer that is more wonderful to use, spewing white-hot liquid promethium to the foes of mankind. It just never seems to get old. You just gotta love the wonderful, awful screams that they all make when they're burning to death. Well, I think it's time that we start wrapping this up, and let's talk about what Fat Shark has done with the presentation, because, oh boy, it looks great. This is the second year in a row where I believe we have gotten really cool glimpses of the nitty-gritty of the 40k universe, particularly when it comes to hive cities. Last year's Necromunda hired gun took us to some really interesting and bizarre locales on Necromunda, and Darktide's presentation of Tertium is no different, since it will take us from the tallest of Hab spires to rearrange a Vox dish to the deep halls of a 41st millennium version of a train station, ferrying hundreds of thousands of manufactorum laborers to the deepest pits of the domains of the Tech Magi. The amount of detail in the environment is completely unmatched. You can see every little thing, every little detail, and how it all works in conjunction in these places, and how people go from place to place. And whenever you get to see some of the more regular aspects like Voidcraft, such as the Morningstar, you get to see how impossibly big they can be. But what I really enjoy is that Tertium is so well realized that even though with our current economies and technologies that makes it all seem impossible, Darktide's design is so well done that in some sort of weirdo, deranged way, it makes these grandiose projects seem very possible in the end. As well, I would like to talk about a little bit about the soundtrack for Darktide, and while in comparison to a bunch of other 40k games, it isn't the most groundbreaking, it takes a lot of those Warhammer elements and adds a little bit of flair to them to make them just different. Whether it be the track that plays at the end of the mission that has that little bit of two-band throat singing, or one of the tracks that show up occasionally that takes these choir vocals but gives them a more electronic sort of backing track. Darktide in this case tries to be that little bit different, and it really helps out in the gameplay. You know you've done something right when I start bobbing my head ritually when the data interrogation music kicks in, because it's a fun little tune to blast the enemies of mankind to. So basically, to conclude Darktide, it's a nice little addition to shooters set in the Warhammer 40k universe. Currently, it's at full price, but if you want to try it out, it's also on Game Pass, and soon apparently there's going to be crossplay between Steam and the Xbox servers. So if your friends have it on Steam and you have it on Game Pass or vice versa, you'll all be able to play soon. With Necromunda, this makes a second year in a row where we've had a magnificent 40k shooter, and hopefully with the release of Space Marine 2 next year, we get to make that a third year in a row of great 40k shooters. But that's enough Darktide for now, so with that, let's get on to number 7.
Number 7.
Coming in at number 7 is the latest Moida mystery visual novel from the likes of Spike Chunsoft with I, the Somnium Files, Nirvana Initiative, which is a sequel to 2019's, I, the Somnium Files. This time around, the game takes place several years after the events of the first game, and we're introduced to a new set of serial murders, this time known as the half-body killings, with the victim being sliced perfectly in half, with one half being discovered in the present time and the other half being perfectly preserved and discovered 7 years in the future. If you played the previous game or any other game that's developed by Kotaro Uchikoshi, then you probably know what you're getting yourself into, but with the Nirvana Initiative, it's a little different. One of the biggest changes to this installment happened before we even saw anything that had to do with the game, and that is of course because Uchikoshi stepped down as director and stayed as the main writer and gave the director chops to his protege, Akira Okada. Usually these kinds of shakeups lead to disastrous results, but I'm glad that for the case of Nirvana Initiative, it actually turned out pretty well. Anyway, to keep going, for those that aren't familiar with visual novels, they're very story-oriented games that may or may not have a lot of gameplay mechanics, but in their place, the stories are usually fantastic. In this case, you play the role of either Mizuki Date, the adoptive daughter of the investigator from the first game, or Ryuki, which is another investigator at Abyss, which stands for Advanced Brain Investigation Squad, which might seem like an acronym from Aqua Teen, but just gotta bear with me here. From there, you'll go from place to place to talk to people involved with the investigation as either suspects or key witnesses, which usually allows the player to take a look at the environment to figure out more clues. Eventually, the investigation leads to a point where you have to go and sync with a person. So that leads us to Nirvana's Initiative's star sort of mechanic, I guess. So let's talk about it. The syncs are the main domain of Abyss, which uses a device that allows the user to delve into the subject's somnium, aka their subconscious, to figure out clues about the investigation that the subject doesn't want to divulge, or may not even be aware is in there, a connection they saw or an experience but without greater context means nothing, and it's our job to go in and take that out of them. In these sequences, you'll have a 6-minute time limit with every action you take, from getting your trusty system Aiba to Poke in memory, to even walking in this minigame will have the seconds count down. Main objective is to figure out the mystery behind the subject and use that to unlock the next stage of the investigation, but in order to do that you'll have to see some real bizarro type stuff. Since the subconscious is shaped by the individual, the world inside these sinks will be shaped by what influences the user. Some are more absurd and some are more creepy, but eventually you'll figure out what the hell is going on amongst their mind. And speaking of figuring out what the hell is going on, let's talk about the narrative for a sec. As I said before, the narrative is split up between two characters, those being Mizuki and Ryuki. And these two characters that you control are because of the jump back and forth between the present and 7 years in the past. Throughout these two timelines, you'll be met with familiar and new characters that are interesting in a variety of different ways due to their circumstances or eccentricity, or because one of them has a goofily block-shaped head for seemingly no reason. The scope of Nirvana Initiative definitely feels a lot larger than that of the first game, since you have mystery spanning 7 years that when you experience it to the end of the timeline only kinda leave you with more questions. With the added complexity, it does have some negative aspects as well. While the narrative isn't bad by any measure and I really do enjoy it, it doesn't have the precision that the first game had with its plot and characters. Another element that I got tired of at the end were the sinks. Unlike in the last game, where something really interesting and dire happened that would be the catalyst to use the sink machine. This time around, you see it coming a mile away for many times, just being sort of a plot convenience. It's not that the narrative is bad in any way though, it's just kind of a cheap argument that despite really enjoying it, I just didn't enjoy the game as well as the first one. Of course I'm saying that it's absolutely worth playing through, otherwise why the hell would it be on the list, but anyway, let's just wrap it up a little bit with the presentation. As far as the presentation goes, Nirvana Initiative is like its predecessors, is one of the highest budget VNs that you are going to see out there, with all the characters having 3D models and full voice acting in either Japanese or English. Lots of other visual novels would use just 2D sprites and only add voice acting for a few select scenes, but for better or for worse, depending if you like the VAs or not, the whole game is fully voice acted. And most everyone does a spectacular job in my opinion, and it works well when the game gets some of its goofy ass cutscenes. But on the whole, that's pretty much all I gotta say with the Nirvana Initiative. As a Japanese visual novel, it's kind of the one that I enjoyed the most this year, though to be honest, I don't really think I played any other ones, but it's absolutely worth playing through, and if you like the first one, then jump in right into the Nirvana Initiative. Nirvana Initiative provides us with some interesting mysteries, some weirdo, goofy characters, and hopefully some laughs along our journey to figure out how the hell does one perfectly cut someone down the middle like a hot dog perfectly. And if you played the first one and want some more action, then go ahead and give it a playthrough. Or if you haven't played the first one, then I would suggest to go back first and enjoy that game before diving into Nirvana Initiative. Now, if you think this is the only Moida mystery game on this list, then you're going to be sadly mistaken, because there's another one coming up near the end, and oh boy, it is a great one. But regardless, let's head on to number 6.
Number 6.
Commander, prepare to engage. On the Imperium! Enemy reinforcements.
In death they fall, their duties fulfilled. And now, as bound by oath, another must rise.
We are at your service, Commander.
Somehow, in the deepest bastions of the Inquisition of the Ordo Malleus on Titan, some people thought it might be a great idea to revive a little-known property known as Chaos Gate, whose original game came all the way back in 1998. This time around, instead of playing some delectable blueberries, you'll be playing the role as a commander in one of the Imperium's most mysterious chapters. Those, of course, being the Grey Knights, that are tasked with solely defeating the forces of chaos and most specifically demons. After narrowly completing a prior mission that kills the previous commander, you are tasked by an Inquisitor to stay in the Terteish sector, to weed out a demonic plague known as the Bloom, spawned by the plague god Nurgle. With an already damaged vessel and crew, you have to pull yourself up and use every trick in the book to defeat the forces of Nurgle. 240k games on the list, you say? 240k games that have to do with Nurgle, you say? Well, it's more likely than you think, so let's talk about Warhammer 40,000 Chaos Gate Demon Hunters. Oh, what a name. First of all, let's start with the gameplay, and unlike in Darktide where you play through the game in a first-person perspective, in this game, which we're just going to call Demon Hunters from now on, you play as a turn-based tactics game, similar to games like XCOM or Warhammer 40,000 Mechanicus. For those of you that are unaware of these types of games, you basically have a crew of people with different classes, weapons, and abilities that you train in your crew and you send them out on missions, where there's a good chance that some of them might not return. The largest culprit of why they might not return is because they gave their lives to defeat the enemies of the Emperor and hold back the tide of chaos for one more day, which means your knights might be destroyed by the weaponry of chaos, plague sorcery of Nurgle, or by the maliciousness of demons. But if they do survive the journey, whether in good condition or in need to be sent to the apothecarium for weeks on end, they will slowly but surely find that their skills will allow the knights to more easily dispatch their foes. Now, in-game, how you defeat them is that your knights will have a pool of points they can use to move from cover to cover, ready an attack, or use it to interact with the environment in a variety of ways. This can be blowing up a plasma battery to melt a bunch of enemies, to shoulder check a statue of the Divine Saints to crush the foes underneath them, or in my favorite, in having an enemy be on the other side of the door and the knight cinematically kick the door in and have them splatter all over. The strategy comes in making sure to have the right amount of points to fight the foes and in some cases run away when your knights really need it. But while turn-based tactics games are nothing new, I find the way that you interact with the environment to be really novel. It never gets old to try and find a solution to a sticky situation and then noticing, oh hey, there's that statue over there conveniently close enough for you to use. Only real gripe that I have is that I wish there was a bit more variety in the classes and arsenal, since a lot of it pretty much is unlocked from the beginning of the game. So it can miss that weapon progression that you get in other kind of turn-based tactics games. Good news is that there's DLC that has been released that adds in dreadnoughts that will make losing your guys all that more interesting, with apparently tech marines on the way as well in the future. So with the gameplay out of the way, we should probably figure out why we're in this sector fighting Nurgle to begin with, and it's a lot more interesting than it lets on. Just like how Darktide had the narrative done by Dan Abnett, in Demon Hunters we get another Black Library recurring author in Aaron Dembski Bowden, who's written such novels as Hell's Reach, a ginormous amount of the Horus Heresy books, and my favorite of his being the Night Lords trilogy, that takes a look at one of my favorite Chaos Legions. This time around, the narrative is a lot more at the forefront, where we have to deal with the rising threat of the Bloom, and the disagreements between the various people and the crew have to combating it. Firstly, there's Ektar, a knight who, in a prior mission before the game, was shamed into serving a penance on board the Baleful Edict and unable to take into combat missions. He mostly has to deal with the knight's well-being and has connections to the overall larger chapter. After that, there's Inquisitor Vakir from the Ordo Malleus, which is the arm of the Inquisition tasked with the hunting and banishment of demons from the Imperium. She butts heads with Ektar all the time due to her radical beliefs and researching the Bloom to find a way to destroy it. Finally, there's my favorite in Lunette, which is the Baleful Edict's tech adept, who looks after how the ship functions and is more embedded with the technical know-how of this crusade, being of course part of the priesthood of Mars. And of course, there's more characters and villains to find throughout the game that I don't want to spoil, except for maybe a Grandmaster of the Grey Knights, voiced by Andy Serkis, that you'll have to deal with from time to time, and he is just great in this game. But overall, the narrative does a good job of slowly ramping up and getting to an exciting conclusion. The only real gripe that I have is that the game struggles with pacing a little bit. Sometimes it feels like the story is drip fed to you, but that's honestly a problem I have with most turn-based tactics games. But it certainly hits the spot, and I got a more interesting and enjoyable story out of it than I did in Darktide, and it has more room in my opinion for Aaron Dembski-Bowden's writing to really show off. So now it's probably a good time to start wrapping this baby up, and let's talk about the presentation for a sec. This section will be a little short since I don't really have a lot to say on the presentation other than, well, it gets the job done. It doesn't have the crazy amount of detail that you're gonna get with a much closer look at the universe like with Darktide or last year's Necromunda Hired Gun, but it shines out in a way that you can customize your knight into how they look in a variety of different trims of armor. More importantly though, I think the presentation aspect really comes out with the actions you can take in combat. I don't know why, but throwing a grenade that sends gibs flying or a knight knocking down a door having it splinter into a bajillion pieces is always satisfying to me. It also has probably one of the coolest Exterminatus cutscenes in 40k that go up there with the one from Dawn of War 2, where Gabriel Angelos of the Blood Ravens gives the speech of how that was all his fault. But to conclude, Demon Hunters was an absolute blast to play through, and as a 40k tactics game, it's pretty damn good. And it's really surprising that we got a year finally where multiple Warhammer 40k games are going to make it onto the list, so I really did enjoy it. Some of you might ask, why is Demon Hunters ahead of Darktide? And that's because overall I played way more of Demon Hunters and really just enjoyed this experience quite a bit more. That's not to say that Darktide is a bad game, because otherwise, well, why would it be on this list then? So I readily recommend both of them. For Demon Hunters, I would get this, and like everything else to be honest, when it's on sale, since it's a little pricey at $50 or 45 euros at full price. But regardless, in terms of hours, I think like all the tactics games, you're gonna rack up a whole lot of time. And with that, damn, we're already halfway through the list. So, without further delay, let's get on to number 5.
Number 5.
Well, after a couple of years in early access, we finally, in 2022 Anno Domini, get the full 1.0 release of Mountain Blade 2, Bannerlord, developed by Tales World Entertainment out of Turkey, which of course is the incredibly long-awaited sequel to Mountain Blade Warband that came out all the way back in 2010. In Bannerlord, you take the role of a random person in the midst of an alternate universe known as Calradia, that looks a lot like Europe and the Near East during the decline of the Calradian Empire, which is basically this universe's Rome. From humble beginnings, you will rise to the occasion as a leader of a band of mercenaries and eventually as part of a kingdom to conquer the lands for your lord, or take up the mantle of Bannerlord yourself and take the world into your own hands. Now, you've probably already heard or played Bannerlord if you play on PC, and the thing is that my rules are no early access games on this list. So, without further delay, now that Bannerlord has reached 1.0, I can finally talk about it and put it on this list for the top 10 games of 2022. So, let's talk about Bannerlord for a little bit. As stated, you'll create a character and their background, which will determine a variety of aspects to the character, from their skills that they'll have, from the weapons they are good at, to which of the game's distinct cultures you'll hail from. From there, you'll start off as small fry with a warband or 10 or so people, where in every little battle with bandits and raiders, you'll have to use your combat skills to make your way to the top. You take on quests from the local villages and cities, and as you level up, your men in the warband will as well, eventually changing into new units entirely with their own unique sets of weapons and armor that are determined by which culture you recruited them from. But after a few hours, your team will expand into more people, and slowly but surely, at a steady pace, your warband will turn from you and your goons to you and the goon army, leading eventually hundreds of men in greater wars to determine the fate of all Karadia. So it's at this point where the game turns from an action RPG sort of, where you're going whoosh, 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 and then it turns into sort of a grand strategy game where you're dealing with whole armies and units, and then after that dealing with towns and kingdoms and diplomacy. There will be a point where your warband gets so big that lords start to notice you, and through the game's diplomacy mechanics you're able to join them and start going after the not so small fry. This in turn, with continued loyalty, means that after besieging a castle successfully, you actually might be chosen to become the lord of that castle, drastically changing the game once again. Now you're figuring out what your town is good for, what it can trade well in, assigning companions to caravans to make sure they don't get raided, and overall start taking a bigger part in the politics of the kingdom. You'll also have chances to upgrade your towns or castles to be more defensible, have better economics, or heal your troops faster when garrisoned there. It's in this stage where the diplomacy becomes incredibly important, because your reputation amongst the different lords and vassals might be the difference between being an ally or captured and ransomed like a dog. This is doubly so if you choose to take up the mantle of Bannerlord and basically start your own empire, which, depending who you separated from, means that you'll need to make some allies quick, because you're going to be making some enemies real quick. There is of course more nitty-gritty that I could get into, but what you need to know is that Bannerlord is an immense sandbox where you can really do almost whatever you want to do to get to the top. And of course, I could be talking about the mechanics for Bannerlord all day, but really let's talk about the presentation for a bit. And while graphically it's not the most impressive thing, when you get to these big battles, there's sort of spectacle to it all. So let's talk about it. Even in 2022, Bannerlord isn't going to be winning any awards in terms of graphical fidelity when it comes to the models, terrain, or various different effects, and honestly, it's understandable for a few reasons. One of which is that this is a Turkish game on a shoestring budget of leftover Iskander kebabs and lukewarm Efes beer. But more importantly is that the game has to hit a balance between something nicer looking than Warband that came out 12 years ago, and something that can render 100 plus models all trying to club each other to death. And honestly, I think Bannerlord rides that line pretty well. Sure, it ain't the prettiest, but in terms of these gargantuan battles, there's a spectacle to the whole thing that you honestly won't get anywhere else. It's like being one soldier in a giant Total War game. Some people might have some troubles running Bannerlord, but if you have even a slightly modern system, then you should be all good to go. Just crank those sliders down till the models end up looking like potatoes and you're gonna be doing great. So what you need to understand with Bannerlord is that it's not just like one individual thing, it's all these individual things that you line them up and you package them into one, package. And there's really nothing like it out there, except for maybe Warband. Ultimately, right now, some might argue that Bannerlord isn't quite as developed as Warband is, and to that I say, well yeah, no shit Sherlock. One game has been out for 2 years and the other one has been out for well over 12. So with that being said, I think with time, the community will develop cool mods for Bannerlord just like they have for Warband. And if we get a couple of cool expansions like the Napoleonic Warfare one for Warband, then we're gonna be super golden. Currently, you can grab Bannerlord off Steam for 65 CAD or 50 euros, which considering with the sheer amount of time you can put into the game, I don't feel it's that bad of a price at all, though if it's like Warband, it's frequently going to be on generous sales, so it's up to you, my friend. So it's time to say adieu to Bannerlord, but fret not, my friends, because this isn't the only game that you control a faction that has a bunch of banners. With that, let's get on to number 4.
Number 4.
We carve our own path through life. It is up to us to decide through whom we carve.
Power is the most intoxicating wine.
I believe Rome is in grave danger.
It's been a long time since the Senate stood for the virtues of Rome.
They are eager for conquest and utterly loyal to your command.
You are fighting for your family and your home.
If they are not with us, they are our enemies.
Another year goes by, and somehow miraculously we have another cool game set during antiquity, this one near the tail end of the final years of the Roman Republic. Latest in the Expedition series, Expedition Rome follows Expeditions Viking and Conquistador, all developed by Logic Artists, a small development team based out of Denmark. Expeditions Rome will take us from our illustrious beginnings as a son or daughter of a noble house of Patrici, and taking us on a journey that will span much of the ancient world, from Asia Minor to Aegyptus to even the eternal city of Roma itself. Fellas, if you know me, you know I love games set in antiquity, especially ones that take the time to portray it as accurately as they can, and Expeditions Rome did an exquisite job at that, so let's talk about it for a bit. In Expeditions Rome, from now just going to be known as Expeditions for simplicity, you play the role of a legatus, which is a role within the Roman military that is basically the equivalent of a modern day general, but colloquially they were known to be the head of a Roman legion. With the control of a Roman legion, that leads us to talk about the gameplay of Expeditions, and it's sort of like Mount and Blade, but really kind of not at all like it. Basically what I mean is that you have the CRPG gameplay where you control your units and make up a variety of different classes, from the tankier Princeps, the more agile Veles, or the spear-stabbing Triarius. Then, you have the overworld management of your legion where they set up forts in various parts of the map and slowly but surely conquer more and more of the area that you're currently campaigning in. While it certainly isn't as in-depth as Bannerlord, it is just deep enough to keep you interested throughout the game and not bog down what is already an incredibly long game. As for the classes, they become particularly important in the ground skirmishes that you're going to find yourself in throughout the game, that sort of resemble Divinity Original Sin if you have ever played it, by being an almost tactical sort of CRPG. What I mean by that is that it's not just about your skills and the weapons, but what kind of resources on the map that you can exploit. Are you going to pick up a torch and light a Nubian on fire, or are you going to use your height to Manga Man? So if Mount and Blade is more about a game about role-playing and picking out who you want to be, then Expeditions is more about the individual battles and how are you going to use your 4D Roman chess to beat the tide of enemies. And in that end, my only real gripe about the gameplay is that sometimes the battle can be so drawn out because they throw so many people at you. You'll have like 5 or 6 goons, and then you'll have like 20 plus enemies on the enemy side, and getting to the end of a simple skirmish can rack up a lot of playtime. So from here on, let's get on to the narrative for a little bit, because while it might seem rudimentary, it's got a lot of other cool things going for it. The narrative for Expeditions isn't going to win any awards, but by the virtue of the setting and how it goes about showcasing it at all, I think it really should get some credit. Like the Forgotten City that came out last year, Expeditions does its absolute best to immerse yourself within the setting of the late Roman Republic, and not just how to make sure that people talk and pronounce things properly in Latin, but also in the use of cultures that most games and people just don't really know exist. Whether it be the Anatolian kingdom of Pontus, which is a Hellenistic, aka Greek, kingdom whose royal line of Mithridatic dynasty was kinda descended from the Persians, or the various Nubian tribes that can be found in North Africa, followed by Ptolemaic Egypt itself, which was a dynasty of Greeks left to rule Egypt after the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great. It just goes to show how incredibly interesting and varied the world of antiquity can be, and it hopefully gets some more people to start giving it more research and figure out what kind of states and culture there were back then. But what of the presentation, you might ask? Well, it's got some really neat presentation by faithfully recreating the look of antiquity in a beautiful way. As far as CRPGs goes, I think Expeditions does a great job in terms of making things look good, but the real star of the show is the design of everything from the lowliest Legion tent to the whole Forum of Roma. It is all lovingly designed, for the most part, to be as accurate to the period as they can be. And it does a great job to showcase not just the different locales, whether it be the beautiful shores of Asia Minor, the endless sands of the deserts of Aegyptus, or the hustle and bustle of the Eternal City itself. I think it also goes a long way to faithfully show how complex these civilizations were. Whenever we think of antiquity or the Middle Ages, some people always think of just like people living in the muck, but during this time, the people of the Mediterranean, they had it pretty swank. But I also appreciate them giving a chance to take a look at the lesser known cultures out there like the nomadic Nubian tribes of Cyrenaica. Ultimately with Expeditions Rome, fellas, if you're looking to go back to the past to kill the shitty Celts that suck ass, then there's really no other place to be than in Expeditions Rome. Expeditions Rome takes an incredibly neat setting and turns it into a wonderful, in-depth CRPG that will give you hours and hours of content to play through and enjoy, especially if you are interested in the Roman Republic or that period of antiquity in general. As I said before, my only real gripe with the game is that around 70 hours, you're going to spend a good chunk of that time in numerous different skirmishes the game will throw your way, and you might be, honestly, a little fatigued of it after a while. The good news is that I found Expeditions, kind of like the other games in its series, to be one of those games that you can put down for a little while, go play something else, go play with the dog for a little bit, go on vacation, whatever the hell you want to do. And then after a while, you can come back, pick it right up from where you were left off, and you'll enjoy it just as much. Honestly, for the price of 45 Canadian dollars or 45 euros, I think it's a pretty good pick just in the amount of time that you got out of your money. Not counting all the other antiquated reasons why you might actually really enjoy this game, so you should go pick it up. And that brings us to the end of Expeditions Rome. So with that, let's head on to number 3.
Number 3.
Kolya's gone. Zenaida is worried because he promised to drive her to Kazan.
I've had bad premonitions.
Something bad is going on in this town.
You need to see this.
Katya grabbed me and locked us in the bathroom. Dad banged on the door.
He boozed away the last of his brains.
They say it's some kind of emergency.
I'm having deja vu. Like this has happened before.
The first in our top 3 is Know by Heart, a small-scale narrative-driven experience developed by Ice Pick Lodge. This is one of those keep things financially afloat sort of games in between the releases of different parts of Pathologic 2, in this case the release of The Bachelor. Premise of Know by Heart is that you play Misha, a man in a provincial town in Russia stuck in a dead-end job and is one day reunited with all of his childhood friends, and they go around town recollecting their youth. Misha, throughout his journey, has to find a way to make all his friends get along, let some bygones be bygones, and try to not get too shy with his childhood crush. So this section with Know by Heart, it's going to be a little bit shorter than the rest of the sections in this video, and that's because 1, it's pretty much a short game, and 2, the less you know about it going in, the better. Usually I leave this for the end, but we're going to talk about the gameplay and presentation because both of them are very basic. Gameplay is basically a very simple adventure game. You walk to objects or people and interact with them, with an occasional activity to shake up the flow for a little bit. One of these activities is taking a photograph that has been ripped up or broken into several pieces, and you have to piece them back together again. It's not really anything crazy, but the moments these happen in are special for the narrative and really dive into the characters. As for the presentation, it is equally as basic as the gameplay itself, and honestly as basic as it gets with simple polygons and textures on most of the models, but to me it didn't really bother me. From the get-go, to me, it is very obvious that the game was done on a shoestring budget, so they could maximize on profit and put those funds towards an even bigger and more ambitious project. But when it comes to some things that would really improve the presentation, then they took that opportunity. For instance, there is substantial voice acting that does a really good job of making everyone feel like a normal person, and when the drama kicks in, you really feel it for these people. Like I said, this game isn't going to be a heavy hitter with the presentation because the meat of the whole game is in its narrative, and my god, it's kind of tragic. While I won't get too deep into the story as to not spoil anything, since if you spoil one thing in such a short game, especially the main hook, then it kind of lessens the impact of the whole experience, in my opinion. But the essence of Know by Heart is that through exploring relationships of all the characters and recalling their youth, we are provided with a sad and tragic and all too real Ice Pick Lodge story that pretty much all Eastern Euros are really good at doing. The main theme with Know by Heart is basically accepting loss and letting go. And the game does it in a really clever way that I'm not going to spoil, but by the end of the adventure, the narrative will leave you feeling a little bit empty, but bittersweet in a way, like most of the Ice Pick Lodge games can do. Know by Heart ultimately doesn't take a whole long to go through, but that little time that you spend with it is a really, really special time, and kind of broke my heart by the end. But if you want to play it, the best thing to do is honestly just go in blind. Honestly, fellas, this is one of those entries that, while being completely unassuming and probably a game most of you might not have even heard of, it hits me in just the right way that it makes it all the way to the top of the list. I'm no stranger to Ice Pick Lodge, and with how things are going on in their part of the world, I can see that things are probably really tight for them with cash, and the fact of the matter is that they've always struggled to get their experiences out there. Know by Heart might be admittedly unassuming because it really is just a stopgap for another even more ambitious project, but that doesn't mean that in a narrative sense they didn't put their all into this game. The game can be found for about $23 Canadian or around 17 euros, and while it might be a bit much for what seemingly you get, I can say that it is worth every penny in my opinion, and if you enjoyed their other games, then you should go right ahead and enjoy it for yourself. Ice Pick Lodge could definitely use that money, and I for sure want to see them succeed as well as they can, especially considering the current situation that they find themselves in. So, with Know by Heart leaving us, we're finally down to the final two games, and man, the one in the top 2 spot, this game is a doozy, so let's get into it.
Number 2.
Agnus revenit oes, Christus in os Patris.
In a shocking twist of fate, Obsidian Entertainment, known for developing games such as Knights of the Old Republic 2, The Sith Lords, Tyranny, and most prominently Fallout New Vegas, came out with a surprise hit in Pentiment. Pentiment is the passion project of Josh Sawyer, who's been at Obsidian since the beginning after Obsidian was developed by ex-Black Isle Studio devs, and oh boy, is this one a great one. In Pentiment, you play the role of Andreas Mahler, who's an artist from the illustrious city of Nuremberg, who's spending his time working as an illuminator at an abbey in the small Bavarian town of Tassing during the Protestant Reformation. That is, until events get into motion and he's got to learn the truth of Tassing and Kirsau Abbey. Man, if you would have told me at the beginning of the year that there was going to be a game that was basically a murder mystery game in the early Reformation in rural Bavaria, I would have probably called you a big fat liar, but no joke, it ain't a lie, so let's talk about it. Firstly, the gameplay of Pentiment is very similar to that of a point-and-click adventure game, but in terms of how you can shape your character, there's a lot of leeway to be had. Since Andreas was a university student, you get to pick certain parts of his background, like where did he go to university and what did he study in said university, and while it doesn't change the overall course of the game, it definitely allows you for some interesting conversations. For instance, you can choose that you went to university in Milano and studied Logos in Latin, so you could use rhetoric and advanced understanding of Latin to figure out the motives of a certain villager or brothers in the abbey. It can even particularly help you out in persuasion, which I really enjoy in Pentiment since they do it a little bit differently mechanically. For instance, most persuasion checks are periodic for a single moment. So it depends on prior actions and how you treated a character that will determine how successful you are. For example, if you're talking to a priest, it depends what kind of priest that they are. If you have a lot of pro-Protestant rhetoric, then you're gonna piss off a Catholic priest, and that might help you or boon you when it comes to the persuasion of said priest and finishing off the persuasion check. And sure, the gameplay might be very simplistic for some, but it's the narrative in the world of this game that puts it so high up on this list. So to continue a bit with the narrative, the big event that happens in the opening act is that the local Baron of Tassing in Kiersau Abbey gets murdered under mysterious circumstances. So it is up to Andreas as the outsider to go around town and see what the townsfolk in the abbey have been up to. This means that you spend time with villagers doing a variety of different tasks, one of them going to a literal knitting circle, or having lunch with some carpenters, or even helping out the nuns in the library return precious books that the brothers in the scriptorium borrowed but haven't yet returned. I especially love the motif of joining people for lunch or dinner since it's such a natural way to learn about the characters in the town. You're going to hear everyone's juicy gossip, and this person's been doing this, and this other person has been doing her, and it's just, ooh, it's all wonderful. But don't think you can just take your time, because with the impending arrival of the Prince Bishop, you actually have a time limit to get all your information together and figure out who did it. So it always leaves you second guessing who the actual murder might have been. Now, what you need to take into special consideration is not just the great narrative that Pentiment has, but the length and the amount of work that they go through to make the town of Tassing come alive. Fellas, I'm going to be real with you, and I'm going to flat out say that Pentiment has probably the best depiction of early 16th century rural Bavaria that I have ever seen in the game before. But I'm also going to be equally as real and just say that, you know, maybe there's not that many contenders for that title to begin with, but anyway. In games set during this period, it is so easy to throw in things that are anachronistic or just don't belong at all, but the writing team does an exquisite job of bringing this interesting period to life. Just everything from how the people talk to each other, how the Catholic Church functioned and its beautiful traditions are shown properly and with the respect that the setting and the subject material deserve. Quick tangent, and I won't make it too political, but I myself am a Catholic, and in most media taking place in the Renaissance or the Middle Ages, it is just so easy to make the church the villain when the reality is that everything in life and in history is just so much more complex than that. Pentiment, to me, showing us the good and the bad of the church and the people of this period goes a long way into respecting not just the setting, but the player as well, allowing us to understand it and make our own conclusions instead of doing the easy thing of, priest guy bad, goes a long way to actually care to portray the setting and its people candidly. And it's not lost on me. I'm certainly no historian, but I absolutely love all kinds of history, and not just like with the Forgotten City last year. There is definitely, in my opinion, room for what I would call, and as corny as it is, edutainment. So if you don't know a lot about the early 16th century Bavaria, then you most likely will know quite a bit more after playing this. And for the game to provide that knowledge to people who are unaware is something that is so incredibly important to me, especially packaging it all into a package that is wonderful and entertaining in its own right, that if this was a story in another period, it would work just as well. Honestly, fellas, I could go all day about talking about how well they use the narrative in the world to make the town of Tasing come alive. But of course, there's other ways to make Tasing and Curacao come alive, and that is of course through its amazing presentation. So let's talk about it. Immediately you're going to be hit with how beautiful this period can be with the excellent medieval/Renaissance tapestry aesthetic to the whole game. It's quite literally like a manuscript from Nuremberg brought to life, with the models for the characters to the background environments. It almost feels like someone plopped their butt down on a Bavarian hillside and painted what they saw around them. I especially love little touches like the calligraphy for different people changing. You got more refined ecclesiastical writing for the priests and the nuns, chicken scratch from the villagers, and more official, refined chicken scratch from the authorities and nobles. Another area that is important to me is just how wonderfully colorful the whole game is. It's so easy and honestly boring to just make the Renaissance or the Middle Ages look like gray puke and fortify the stupid idea that the peoples and areas from these periods were just unenlightened. The truth is that the Middle Ages were just as colorful as we are today, with a variety of cultures that can be found from all over Europe, but it's much easier to display the Middle Ages like it's all just medieval stinky London. And while it doesn't show up all the time, the soundtrack for Pentiment has some really good moments. It uses instruments of the era, such as a variety of flutes, and my favorite being liberal use of the hurdy-gurdy, which is a really neat instrument that's almost like a bunch of violins tied together and you hand crank it and it plays some really cool sounds. And when it hits in the title sequence, you know exactly what kind of experience you're going to be finding yourself in. There's also one of the brothers in the abbey that you can hear do a rehearsal for his chants, and while it's difficult to explain, Obsidian did an excellent job of bringing out the sound of being in a church that are known for their beautifully wonderful acoustics.
Christus innocens patri, reconciliavit peccatores, mos ad vita duello conflixere mirando.
Overall, Pentiment was an absolute pleasure to play through, and it will be for anyone that is interested in that period of history. Just like Moondown from last year that made me want to go to the Swiss canton of Grisons up in the Alps, that still, sadly, hasn't happened yet, Pentiment makes me want to do the same thing and grab my bags to go up to Bavaria and visit some interesting locales in rural Bavaria way up in the Alps. And Pentiment is one of those experiences that if you are at all interested in playing through a murder mystery in a wonderfully recreated and portrayed early 16th century Bavaria, then Pentiment is an absolute purchase for you. You can go and grab Pentiment on Steam for about $25 Canadian or 20 euros, but if you are a subscriber to Game Pass, then you can go and grab the game off there right now, and you better, because I want to see more experiences like this in the future. Luckily, if the words of Josh Sawyer aren't to be believed, apparently this project only got greenlit because of a thing like Game Pass, so hopefully more games like it will show up in the future because Pentiment was just wonderful. And the worst part about all of it is that this game just so barely, narrowly makes it into Game of the Year, but sadly for Pentiment, there is one game on this list that makes it the Game of the Year, so let's get on to it.
Number 1.
Now fellas, if you knew me or you watched my videos this year, then you would have known from the get-go what would go on to become my favorite game of 2022. Though admittedly, I only really put out 2 videos, of which one of them is of course Signalis, developed by Rose Engine. In Signalis, you play the role of a replica, which is basically an android that goes by the name of Elster, which is short for LSTR, a type of replica that's outfitted with distant space travel in mind. But that goes all to hell when the spacecraft you were traveling in crash lands on the shadowy moon of Ling, near the Sierpinski mining facility. Equipped with only your wits and a photo of a girl, you are tasked with entering the facility and keeping a promise that you made long ago. Now, in a twist of fate, this section might actually be a lot shorter than I make it out to be in most years with Game of the Year, but that's because I actually already have a review on it already out. So you can either go and watch it right now, or you could wait till the end of the video where I'll have it there, or it can be in the description as well. But anyway, let's talk about Signalis. Signalis, my friends, is as close as we're going to get to the likes of survival horror games of old when it comes to the gameplay, ranging from the controls to even the pacing of the gameplay itself. For starters, you have a very limited inventory of only 6 slots, which you have to then juggle between your weapons, healing items, and various quest items, which in turn gives you a set of dilemmas. Are you going to gear up and have a bunch of weapons and ammo to combat the array of decrepit, corrupted replica that can be found throughout the facility? Or are you going to carry more puzzle items so you can attempt to complete the puzzles on the go and then heal up at save stations instead? What I enjoy of this style of gameplay is that it gives you problems with no easy solutions that can be found only in real survival horror games, and that's because you can't just hide in a locker and take it easy till the monster goes away. What's even better is that since the replica you deal with are effectively androids, they won't just stay down when you kill them, and the only real way you can get rid of them for good is to throw some good old thermite on their carcass so they can melt away into a puddle of molten steel. On top of the shooty and replica killing combat, there's also a slew of different puzzles that you'll come across that range from something fairly simple to more esoteric stuff that you won't even know is a puzzle unless you really understand the quirks of radio signals. And especially the radio I find to be particularly interesting as a motif that is used throughout the game. Whether to be used as something to broadcast Swan Lake to unlock a special container, or to broadcast a signal to dispatch the poor, horrendously corrupted Colibri replica. Speaking of corruption, I think it's time that we talk about Signalis' narrative, and man, it's so good, but it makes me so sad. The game deals with heavy themes of corruption and the ideas of promises and pacts, which can be seen throughout the game in really clever ways. For the most part, Signalis is going to display its story through notes and other forms of environmental storytelling that you'll find in the Sierpinski facility. It can be something like a manual for a certain type of replica and what they need to be stable, or the numerous propaganda posters for the totalitarian communist shithole society influenced by East Germany Elster finds herself in. Now fellas, it's time to start talking a little bit about the feel of the game and wandering the different halls of the Sierpinski facility. While the horrors are all too real, there's an element to it all that makes it feel so distant, like you're in some sort of dream. And if we take into account a lot of things that have seemingly influenced the developers at Rose Engine, then the idea that we are in some sort of dream or nightmare isn't so strange. Now, while unconfirmed, Signalis feels like a 12-hour version of that opening act of Lost Highway, a film directed by David Lynch, where the characters in that act are wandering in and out of reality in their own home, with stark, swallowing shadows and distant sounds throughout that kind of haunt you. Signalis also takes a lot of inspiration from real-world writers and short stories. For instance, it directly gives credit to H.P. Lovecraft, Ambrose Bierce, and really obviously in one Robert William Chambers, with their specific works being The Festival, An Inhabitant in Carcosa, and The King in Yellow, respectively. All in all, it creates a really unique melding of ideas that brings us a story wrapped in horror, corruption, dark pacts, and ultimately, once you get through to the end, tragedy. It should be no surprise that all the games in the top 3 have really touching narratives, and Señales for me was the most touching of all of them. And while I would once again love to just talk ad nauseum about Señales, I would basically be doing a repeat of the video I already have out, so with that, let's finish it up with Señales' presentation. From the get-go, you can see that Señales has your typical PSX revival sort of graphics, but if you look within, then there's more to be found there. For instance, the design of the replica themselves, with their flat feet and more industrial style to them, are very reminiscent of the artwork of Tsutomu Nihei, who's done manga like Blame and Knights of Sidonia. Other styles that I really enjoyed are the influences of real-world paintings, like Isle of the Dead and Shores of Oblivion by Arnold Böcklin and Eugene Braque, respectively, that start to create a very cinematic feel to the whole experience. This is then compounded by the soundtrack that also has a range of different feelings and motifs, going from more solemn, haunting tracks that occur whenever Alistair is alone in the facility, to more violent, teeth-grinding industrial tracks that would not be out of place fighting the beasts in the otherworld in Silent Hill. But most important to me is the inclusion of tons of classical music that, like the paintings, elevate the experience into a very cinematic, experience. You'll hear Vivaldi's L'estate while looking forlorn at the snowy surface of Lang, hear the rising crescendo of Chopin's Raindrop Prelude to the title sequence of the game, with horrific results, and watch people dance to Schubert's Statien. All in all these things put together create an incredibly wonderful product when it comes to the presentation of Señales, and single-handedly out of all the games on this list, it was the most special, interesting, and unique out of them presentation-wise. Now, fellas, what you have to understand is that it might not look like much, but all of these individual elements put into one package makes for an incredibly unique and heartbreaking experience that is just unlike any other, and that's what Señales is all about. Señales is one of those survival horror games that only comes around every so often, fellas. There really isn't a whole lot out there that will give you the horror elements, the narrative elements that make you care, and the presentation to wrap it all into a very cinematic and transformative package that gives us something truly incredible. A unironic tour de force of horror storytelling and gameplay. I feel with time that Señales will easily join the pantheon of the great survival horror games like Fatal Frame, Resident Evil, and of course, Silent Hill. If there is one game in 2022 that you should play, unless of course you don't like survival horrors, then okay, don't worry about it. But anyway, you can grab Señales on Steam for $27 Canadian or 20 euros. And if you have Game Pass, then you can go and grab it right now as part of your subscription. Once again, my friends, if you want more details, then the review I have made will be down in the description or at the end of the video for you to enjoy at your leisure, where I'll go way more deeper into the themes, into the gameplay, and of course, the beautiful presentation of Señales. And there you have it, fellas. Señales is the official Tomthechosen1 Game of the Year for 2022. And man, what a great year 2022 was. Though I didn't get as many videos out as I wanted to this year, fellas, 2022 has been an absolutely amazing year for me for a few reasons. But the big reason is that finally in the fall, I left Canada and started my new life here in Italy that I've been waiting to do for so many years. And while there has been a few hiccups here and there, I would not trade the world for it. Not for a minute, fellas. And since I'm currently still unemployed, I'm going to be making more videos. Hopefully I can do 1 or so a month, but if I can get more than 2 a month, that would be great. But to set expectations, I'm just only going to do 1 a month. Finally, in 2023, there's a lot of games that I'm really excited for, and so hopefully they don't get delayed anymore, but let's go over a few of them. Starting off, I'm really excited to finally get a sequel to Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine that came out all the way back in 2011. We've been getting a healthy stream of Warhammer 40k shooters, so one that takes the weapons and the might of an Astartes, instead of those puny mortals that just kind of make me sick, will be a nice treat after so long, and I'm excited for it. Secondly, and this one might come as a surprise to some of you, but I'm cautiously optimistic of Starfield, which is of course the latest game from Bethesda Game Studios. Now, I'm cautiously optimistic because unlike Elder Scrolls or Fallout that are prior properties that I have expectations for, Starfield is a brand new property, so they can't disappoint me by being worse than the previous iteration because, well, there is no previous iteration. Another big one is that Todd Howard in interviews, and even though I know he likes to speak his sweet little lies, in these interviews he's talking about one of the main influences is Traveler, which is a tabletop RPG that's really kind of hard sci-fi. In that game, the spaceships are more like submarines and like distances are super long, so it's really neat and it kind of reflects in all these skills that you could see in the game already. So I'm kind of cautiously optimistic, so we'll see how it goes from there. Finally, there is the super long awaited Stalker 2 that for the fans of the first game we've been waiting ages for, and while there's not a lot of gameplay, I'm hoping that it will be just as wonderfully jank as its predecessor in Shadow of Chernobyl. This is one of those games, of course, that if it sadly gets delayed into the next year or the year after that, I can absolutely see why with the tragedy that is sadly going on in Ukraine. It's something truly amazing in my opinion to still be developing games when air sirens are going off in the background. Like, it's just truly insane and incredible, and I hope the best for that team. So there you have it, fellas. That is the end of the video. If you've made it this far, then thank you so much. I love every single one of you, and it means so much to me that you've made it this far. For any of the people that are new here, well, hey, welcome to the show. This might not be the best way to get into this because it's so long, but once you get a couple years, you'll understand. But thank you so much for coming and watching. If you're new, might I suggest to watch my other videos, and if you really like them, then maybe just subscribe to my channel. That'd be really cool. But for everyone else as well, I wonder, what were your top 10 picks of 2022? You know, like, there's a lot of cool games that came out, and there's some games on this list that I didn't talk about that might be your picks, so I'd like to hear them below if you can, or even if it wasn't from 2022, was there a game that you played that's new to you that you really enjoyed? I'd love to hear it, so put it on down there. But regardless, this is Tomthechosen1 with a horde of evil men outside of my house called Sardinians that are trying to kill me. Anyways, I'm gonna unleash Tomthechosen2 on him, so I'll see you guys next time.